And there was an article that came out recently. Actually, yeah, came out very recently. It was published by a Turkish newspaper called Milliyet. And it says here in this article, Israeli experts assessed that Israel was following the wrong policy in Syria and that Turkey's hand in the country was stronger than Israel's after the overthrow of the 61-year-old Ba'ath regime. So that's why the Israelis are clinging on to the Americans. That's why they're clinging on to the Russians, because they know that they will not survive in a war with Turkey alone. They know that they will not survive in a war with Iran alone. They cannot fight a war by themselves. They need the help of the Americans. And it says here that the Israeli army, which has carried out hundreds of airstrikes on various targets in Syria since the fall of the regime, expanded its occupation of the Golan Heights. We all know this, right? So Israel expanded into Syria. And it says here that Israel advanced to within 20 kilometers of the Syrian capital, Damascus, and attempted to incite the Druze community in Syria against Damascus. What is the end result? Israel began to mess with Turkey's airbase in Syria. Now, the airbase, granted, used to belong to the Assad regime. It's called the T4 airbase in the Palmyra region in Syria. But Turkey now says, hey, listen, we overthrew Assad. We took over the country. That's our airbase. And no one needs to mess with it. No one better mess with the T4 airbase in the Palmyra region. Well, guess who messes with the airbase? Israel does. And Israel bombs the airstrip. Israel bombs the runway on the airbase. And it says here that the Israeli army also carried out airstrikes on the T4 military base in the Tedmur, Palmyra district of Homs province, where Turkey is alleged to be based in Syria. And so Turkey said, that's it. Israel, you can't be doing this. We can't be doing this. We're eventually going to have to clash. And so Netanyahu takes a flight to the U.S. He meets with Trump, and he asks Trump for help when it comes to Turkey. Trump tells Netanyahu, listen, I'm friends with Erdogan, but you got to be reasonable. In other words, stop being so damn reckless and bombing Syria and pissing off the Turks. Don't do that, because you are not in the stronger position in this conflict. You're not. Turkey is the second most armed country in NATO. Turkey has a vibrant, growing military industry. So does Israel, granted. But Turkey has a very efficient drone system. If Israel goes to war with Turkey, it is game over. You're talking high casualties. You're talking a devastated Israel. So the guys who wrote this article, they interviewed two people. They interviewed the former ambassador to Israel, his name is Alon Liel, and they also interviewed the vice chancellor of Tel Aviv University, Professor Dr. Eyal Zisser. And they're both saying that this is a disaster, that the idea of Israel versus Turkey is it's a disaster. And it says here that stating that Israel is pleased with the end of Iranian influence in Syria, Liel said that the Tel Aviv administration prefers Russia over Turkey's influence. Absolutely. But is Russia going to save the day for Israel? I think that if Russia ever saves Israel, it'll be after many Jews are killed. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm saying it's a very bad thing. And I'm saying that's a very sad predicament that lies in the future. But just as the Russians saved the remnant of the Jews in Europe from the German reign of terror, I think the Russians will eventually save the remnant of the Jews in the end. Because history rhymes. And it says here that Liel explained the reason for this by saying, because when Russian President Vladimir Putin was there with his army, the skies of Syria were our skies. He allowed Israel to attack whenever it wanted. He coordinated with our forces. I think Israel's feeling is that if Turkey establishes itself militarily, it will not allow Israel to bomb Syria. So what this Israeli guy is saying is that Russia, before Turkey took over Syria, Russia allowed the Israelis to do airstrikes on Syria. But if Syria becomes a territory of Turkey, and it already is, Israel's not going to have that leeway. Israel's not going to have that freedom. So what is it going to do? This is why I say there will be an inevitable clash, because the interests of Israel and Turkey are so opposed. They are so antithetical to each other. And the article goes on to say that for the last 15 years, Turkey, except for 1 or 2 years, has been seen as an enemy country in Israel. That is why Israel prefers Russia to Turkey in Syria. Then why the hell were you helping the enemies of Russia and the enemies of Russia's ally, Bashar al-Assad? Why? This is why I say, I don't know if Israel is retarded, if it's just so evil that it's reckless. I'm not sure. But they were arming and they were backing the HTS, and the HTS took over Syria. Now they're mad. Now they're clinging on to Assad's ally, Russia. Why couldn't you just have allowed Assad to stay there? You would have had Russia there. You would have been fine. Why in the hell did you do this, Israel? Israel, this is what I keep saying. Israel is like Haman. Haman said, I'm going to kill all the Jews in the Persian Empire. And what happened? Haman made a noose for Mordecai, only for himself to be hung by that very noose. Judas said, okay, I'm going to conspire to have Christ crucified. And then what happened? The noose went around Judas's neck. And what does the name Judas mean? What does the name Judas mean? Look it up. What does it mean? What happened to Judas is a prophecy. And it's a prophecy in the sense that Israel is going to do things that will lead to its own demise. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. Just like Judas killing himself wasn't a good thing. Judas could have gone to Jesus just like Peter did, could have gotten repentance, but he didn't. He chose self-destruction. And that story is a lesson for Israel. It's a lesson that Israel will do things that will be to its own demise. I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm saying it's a bad thing. And that's the thing. So it says here that Liel claimed that Israel's decision to align itself with Iran, because if you align with Russia, you align with Iran, which it describes as an enemy on the Syria issue, is due to the fact that the two states see Syrian President Mr. Shada as a common enemy. So Iran hates the Sunnis, Iran will see Shada as an enemy, and now Israel is clinging on to the biggest ally of Iran, which is Russia. But I thought Iran was the big bad guy. I thought anyone who's an ally of Iran needed to be dismantled. Why are you clinging on to Russia? Recalling that Turkey and Israeli delegations met in Azerbaijan regarding Syria, Liel said that the Turkish-Israeli dialogue was not at a good level. So Israel and Turkey started talks in Azerbaijan. I did a video about this after it was announced, and I said, listen, it's all pointless. The normalization talks between Turkey and Israel are not going to work in the end. They're going to have some piece of diplomacy, right? They're going to have some semblance of diplomacy between each other, but in the end, it's not going to work because they have such antithetical interest. Turkey has a lot of Jew hatred. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in Turkey, and also there is just the fact that Turkey wants to control Syria. Israel doesn't want to allow that, and Israel wants to have the freedom to willy-nilly bomb its enemies in Syria. And Turkey cannot just sit there and allow that to happen without looking weak, and Turkey does not want to look weak. So the end result is going to be bloodshed. There will be blood. And so, yes, you have these talks between Turkey and Israel, but as Mr. Liel here says, the Turkish-Israeli dialogue are not at a good level because Israel is at a disadvantage. And it says here that the retired ambassador who drew attention to the fact that Israel made a mistake regarding Syria said, quote, Israel sees itself as having the same status as Turkey in Syria, but not the same status, because Shara invited Erdogan and called on Turkey to defend Syria. We are not wanted there. Therefore, there is no possibility of Israel and Turkey sharing Syria. It is a very dangerous mistake for Israel to see itself as equal to Turkey in Syrian territory. Turkey was invited to control Syria. Israel was not. Plus, if Turkey gets too friendly with the Israelis and continues down that road, Turkey will be seen by the Muslim world as just a part of the Zionist regime, or Turkey will be seen as being in cahoots with the Zionists, and it just, no matter how you look at it, it just will not look good for the Turks if they are nice with Israel. So there will eventually be a clash. Zisser, who said Israel was caught unprepared for the Syrian revolution, said, Israel was caught off guard, and I think Israel is still under the trauma of October the 7th. Many Israelis, especially the far-right government, which felt free to do whatever it wanted after the election of U.S. President Donald Trump, are experiencing the trauma. And look at what it says here. Remembering that the U.S. had withdrawn troops from Syria. Because remember, I talked about this last week. Donald Trump has begun troop withdrawal out of Syria. Well, how does that help Israel? It helps Turkey. And I've said this a million times, and I'm going to keep saying this. America doesn't want to lose Turkey. So they have to appeal to Israel. They have to appease Israel. But at the same time, they have to appease Turkey. Because Turkey controls access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And America cannot and does not want to lose that control. Because through Turkey, the U.S. can control access from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, thus handicapping the Russians. And so America doesn't want to lose that control. America doesn't want to lose that leverage that Turkey provides. So look at this quote here. With this in mind, look at what Donald Trump said here. Trump is the one making the decisions in the world right now, and especially in Israel. He told Netanyahu very clearly that Syria belongs to Erdogan. And what did Donald Trump say not too long ago? He said the future of Syria belongs to Turkey. He said the person who will make the decision on the future of Syria is Erdogan. And you have to talk to him. I will help you, but you have to talk to him. So Israel doesn't want friendliness with Turkey. It wants to continue to advance its position in Syria. That is to the ire of the Turks. America doesn't want to lose Israel, but at the same time, it doesn't want to lose Turkey because of the Dardanelles, because of the access way from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So, as I've said many times, if push comes to shove, the U.S. will abandon Israel to choose Turkey, to please Turkey. So Israel will eventually be abandoned. And I don't think that's a good thing, but I'm just telling you what I think is going to happen. I'm giving you my prognostication, my prediction. That's what I think is going to happen. But Israel doesn't want to be abandoned because Israel cannot face Turkey alone. So there's going to be a war between the Turks and the Israelis. And Turkey sees itself as a revived Ottoman Empire. That's why they want to control Syria. When the Ottoman Empire was at its peak, it was when they took over Constantinople from the Byzantines, from the Eastern Roman Empire. So they took over the Eastern Roman Empire. And Mehmet II said, I am the Caesar. He said, I am the Caesar. I am the new leader of the Roman Empire. And so the Ottomans sort of saw themselves as a continuation of the Roman Empire. And so what was the capital of Byzantium? It was Constantinople. What was the capital of the Ottoman Empire? Constantinople. So the Ottoman Empire continued the power of Constantinople after squashing or crushing the Byzantines. So if you have a revived Ottoman Empire, it'll sort of be like the revival of Islamic Byzantium, if you will. And what happened the last time Israel was at war with the Roman Empire? It was after the resurrection of Christ. And what did that lead to? It led to what? The destruction of the temple, but it also led to a civil war. And the Romans won, the Jews lost, but at the same time the Judeans butchered each other prior to the destruction of the temple. What are the fanatics in Israel obsessed with? They're obsessed with the land, but they're also obsessed with building a third temple. So they're obsessed with what? A temple. The Judeans who were at war with the Romans were obsessed with what? The temple. And that's why when the temple caught on fire, many Judeans leaped into the flames, according to Josephus, because they chose death over watching their temple burn. And so the fanatics today want what? They want to control Syria. That is to the ire of the Turks. And the recklessness of Israel is eventually going to lead to a war between what? Israel and this revived Islamic Byzantium. The Israeli fanatics also want to build a temple. If they build a temple, that is going to cause major friction within Israeli society, not just between Jews and Arabs, but between Jews themselves, because you have the moderate Jews who don't want this, and then you have the fanatical Jews who do want this. At the same time, really the fault line between the Jews themselves is, from what I understand, this aspiration of Netanyahu to do a judicial overhaul. This is the biggest cause of contention and division between the Jews in Israel. If the judicial overhaul happens, it will be a major fault line within Jewish society, and you will have massive division and fragmentation within Israel. And there was a prediction that was recently made by Yair Lapid. Jews will kill Jews, says Yair Lapid. I'll shorten this window real quick to make it more fitting. Jews will kill Jews. Israel's top politicos warn of impending civil war. So back in ancient times, you had the Judeans. They went to war against the Romans, but at the same time, there was a civil war over what? Who was going to control Jerusalem? Who was going to control the temple? In other words, who was going to be in power in Judea? Today, you have friction between who? Moderate Israelis, radical Israelis who want to dismantle the power of the Supreme Court so that the Knesset could have supreme power. In other words, they want to just get rid of the power of the Supreme Court, pack the Knesset with their people, and then have complete and absolute control in Israel. And then they also want to build a third temple. And that third temple would be a symbol of what? A symbol of Jewish power in Israel. Because if you have a third temple, it will be in the Dome of the Rock, and that would be an expression of power over the Arabs. At the same time, if they do a judicial overhaul, that is going to cause violent friction between the Jews themselves. So it's really a fight over power, but it's also a fight over who is going to lead the vision of what is Israel. Which vision of Israel is going to manifest itself? That's really what the struggle is over. And so, back in ancient times, you had the Judeans fighting the Romans, but the Judeans were killing each other over power. And I think in the future, there's going to be a war between the Judeans of our time against this revived Islamic Byzantium, which is just a continuation, in a sense, not 100%, but in a sense, a continuation of the Roman Empire, or an attempt at continuing the Roman Empire. And at the same time, there's going to be killing between the Jews in Israel. History doesn't exactly repeat, but it does rhyme, is what I'm trying to say. And so it says here, Jews will kill Jews. Israel's top politicos warn of impending civil war. And it says here that Netanyahu's war is not just on Gaza, the occupied West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, Iraq. It is on Israel's own institutions, opposition parties, and the last shreds of internal dissent. Now, the occupation state's most senior political veterans are warning of a full civil war. And I've talked about this since 2021. But if you look at history, it does ring a bell. Go read Josephus's History on the Roman-Judean War. You can go read it for free online. It's quite a long book, so I would suggest that you actually buy a physical copy of it. That way you can actually take it with you to bed and not have to depend on a computer to read it. And plus you can write notes in the margins, and it's very helpful. But I would recommend that everyone read Josephus's War, because it is one of the, if not the most fascinating books, the most fascinating book I've ever read. Very, very good book. I love this book. And it really brings to light the world of the New Testament. And it really shines a light on the world that Christ lived in and the barbarity of that world. But it talks about a war with the Romans, and it talks about how in the midst of that war there was a civil war. And so what do we see in the midst? What do we see looming through the fog? We see Israel talking about a potential war with Turkey, and we see talk about a civil war within Israeli society. Josephus speaks! This is what I say. Josephus speaks. He speaks through his history. And through history, and by looking at the current events, we can see the rhyming of the symphony of history. It's very fascinating stuff. Very fascinating stuff. It's quite surreal, I must say. So it says here that before the launch of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on October the 7th, 2023, this is when Hamas did a massacre in Israel, Netanyahu's ruling coalition had pushed hard for judicial reforms aimed at neutering Israel's Supreme Court. Yep, Exactly. With no formal constitution, Israel relies on the Supreme Court as a final check on executive overreach. Dismantling this institution was a central goal for Netanyahu and his far-right allies. Why is it a goal? As I've said many times, the nationalists in Israel are winning in the demographic game. They know their numbers are increasing tremendously. They know they dominate ideology in Israel. So what do you have? Let's say you have a Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could be a threat to you if you have Supreme Court justices that are contrary to your agenda. But what happens if you just get rid of it? Then the Supreme Court will never be a threat to you. The Supreme Court will never be an impediment to you. And you could just stack the Knesset, and then you take over. And then you could put Christians in prison, and you could destroy churches and do whatever you want. You can bring back the Sanhedrin. And there you go. You're done. So it says here that at the time, President Isaac Herzog was already warning that a civil war was approaching. So Isaac Herzog made this warning. Yair Lapid made this warning. Hell, even Natan freaking Yahu made this warning. He did. He made this warning because he wanted to do the judicial overhaul, and then he put a pause on the judicial overhaul, and he said that when it comes to a civil war, basically the stability of the country is more important. So even he acknowledged the prospect of a civil war in Israel. It's a pretty big deal. And so it says here, weekly protests erupted in Tel Aviv and occupied Jerusalem. Demonstrators feared a theocratic redefinition of the state that would erase its secular character. And they're right, because that's what these people want to do. They want to create a purely fanatical nationalistic Jewish state that would have elements of Talmudism in it. Even Israeli intelligence and military personnel joined in opposition, and in March 2023, the Histadrut, the occupation state's top labor union, endorsed a general strike. Many soldiers even refused to serve. Yeah, this was a big deal, I remember. I remember reading about this years ago. It was a big deal. So there's some major fault lines in Israeli society, and the big fault line is judicial overhaul. Judicial overhaul for the cause of fanaticism. And a lot of Israelis don't want that. It says here that though the war on Gaza temporarily sidelined this internal crisis, and that's why I think they did. That's why I think they allowed for October the 7th to happen, because there was all this talk about civil war, and then Netanyahu talked about it, and there was just all this discussion about a potential for civil war in the Israeli media. Haaretz was talking about it, and all of a sudden, boom, October the 7th. And they knew it was going to happen. They knew that Hamas wanted to do a big attack on Israel. They didn't care. They let it happen. That's very obvious. They let it happen. And why did they let it happen? I think for this very reason. It was to put the anti-Likud movement in the back burner. It was to sideline the anti-judicial overhaul protests. And it was to sideline everyone towards a war. Well, now the war is in a much calmer condition than it was around a year ago or so. So then what's going to happen? Now, the fog of war is dissipating, and the anti-Netanyahu movement is back in order, business as usual. And that's what I said. I remember back in 2023, I said this during a live stream. I said, guys, eventually the war is going to calm down, and when it does, the anti-Netanyahu sentiment is going to come right back. It's not going to stop. And I was right. I just know these things. People don't magically get up and say, oh, yeah, let's like Netanyahu. It's just not going to happen. And look at what it says here. Meanwhile, around 100,000 Israeli reservists are refusing to show up for duty. It's a small army. Israel doesn't have a big military. Imagine 100,000 soldiers not wanting to go fight in Gaza. They don't give a shit about Gaza anymore. They don't even want to go there anymore. We don't want to go kill people over there anymore, because they realize that this war is just to the interest of the Likudists. The broader public mood reflects deep unease. According to Ma'arev, 60% of Israelis now believe civil war is a real danger. 60% of Israelis now believe civil war is a serious prospect in Israeli society.